the ridden horse pain ethogram comprises 24 behaviors, and we have demonstrated that the majority of these behaviors are at least 10 times more likely to be seen in a lame horse compared with a non-lame horse. And of the most frequent, there'll probably be ears back, repeated swishing of the tail, opening the mouth, things that we have inherently grown up with as riders and assumed were normal behaviors for horses. But in fact, pain-free horses don't do a lot of these behaviors on a repeated basis.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this new episode of The Modern Rider, the first equestrian podcast that brings together the sports and horsemanship. A special place to discover inspiring interviews with the best equestrian professionals to help us become better, more aware and responsible riders. Today we're going to delve into a crucial and often underestimated topic: pain in the ridden horse. We've all heard different opinions, beliefs, and myths on this topic, but how much do we really know? Is it possible that some signals that we interpret as bad mood or resistance in our horses are related to pain during riding? To address these questions and many more, today we are honored to have with us an authority on the matter. An equine veterinarian whose work has changed the way we understand and approach the well-being of our equine companions. Sue Dyson is known worldwide for her expertise in pain research in ridden horses. As a specialized veterinarian, she has dedicated her career to improving the quality of life for our equine friends. Today, she will join us to share her knowledge, debunk myths, and provide us with clearer insight into how we can ensure our horses' comfort and happiness during riding. As always, do not hesitate to leave a note, a comment, or share it with those around you. It is the best way to let me know, give visibility to the podcast, and above all, do the great work of our guests. So turn up the volume and get comfortable to listen to this exciting new interview. Well, good morning, Sue. Welcome to The Modern Rider. As I told you earlier, I'm very, very glad you accepted to be part of this podcast and to come as a guest to talk about your experience and your work. So, yes, welcome.
It's a real pleasure. It's really important, I think, to share information.
Yes,
and promote ideas, make people think.
Exactly. That's what we're here for. Well, the first question I like to ask to my guest is to allow the people to know you better. Could you tell us a bit about your equestrian background and what led you to specialize in equine veterinary medicine?
Well, I was a rider. I rode upper national level in the UK in both eventing and show jumping. I had 3 superstar horses that were sold and went on to Olympic Games and European Championships, one of whom was owned by a Spanish person who went to 2 Olympics, which was very, very exciting. And I was a bit of a late starter thinking about what I wanted to do professionally. I didn't think that I was good enough as a rider, and therefore it seemed sensible to be a veterinarian. But I only went to vet school with the idea of being an equine veterinarian. And very soon after I graduated, I really wanted to focus on lameness and poor performance because I realized as a rider, those were the most common reasons why horses were out of work.
Were there other veterinary at that time studying this particularly subject, or was it new?
I think that lameness was done at a much lower level.
Okay.
There was a reluctance to perform nerve blocks other than to desensitize the foot. There was never any concept that it was important to evaluate horses ridden, whereas I felt as a rider, you couldn't understand the rider's problems unless the horses were seen ridden. So, yes, there were people doing lameness, but I think I've carved a furrow, as it were, doing things a little bit differently and doing things in more depth. And because I'm a rider and have ridden problem horses that have got underlying pain, I think I understand much better than many veterinarians do how pain can influence horses and their performance.
Yes, you have an extra view of the subject and the feeling as well.
Yes, very much.
So, as we said, you're known for your studies on pain in competition horses and the creation of the Ridden horse pain Ethogram. I obviously have several questions about these studies. How can we use them? What is their influence on how we've practiced our sport and manage our horses? But I think it's maybe best to start with the basics. So I wanted to ask you, what are the most common signs of pain or discomforts in horses and what causes them?
Well, I think we have to remember, first of all, that every horse is an individual and they have different pain thresholds and they react differently to pain. So one horse may be reluctant to go forwards, whereas another horse may want to take off with the rider and bolt. So those are individual adaptations to underlying pain. The Ridden horse pain ethogram comprises 24 behaviors, and we have demonstrated that the majority of these behaviors are at least 10 times more likely to be seen in a lame horse compared with a non-lame horse. And of the most frequent, there'll probably be ears back, repeated swishing of the tail, opening the mouth, things that we have inherently grown up with as riders and assumed were normal behaviors for horses. But in fact, pain-free horses don't do a lot of these behaviors on a repeated basis. And this is the difference, I think, in understanding when a behavior is significant or otherwise. It has to be observed repeatedly, and it has to be observed in association with other behaviors. You cannot just take a single behavior and say, this horse rears, it must be in pain. That is completely misleading. If a horse shows multiple behaviors, and we know that if the horse shows 8 or more of the 24 behaviors that are in this, what we call an ethogram, which is just a series of behaviors with specific definitions. I like to call it a checklist for riders because that's simpler. If the horse shows 8 or more behaviors of the checklist, then it is highly likely to be because the horse is experiencing some discomfort in its work. It doesn't tell us about where the pain is coming from because each horse acts as an individual. We can obviously use it as a monitoring tool. So if you're regularly riding your horse and it regularly scores 2 out of 24, that's completely normal. But if that score starts to rise and then gets to 6 out of 24, that's an alarm bell. There's probably something going wrong. And unquestionably, if your horse is showing 10 of the 24 behaviors, there is something wrong. And the sooner it's investigated, the more likely it is that you will be able to successfully manage the problem. So it's a tool to help riders and trainers recognize that there is a problem. It's a tool to help veterinarians recognize that there is a problem, because veterinarians have been trained in a fairly superficial way to recognize a head nod reflecting a forelimb lameness or a hip hike reflecting hindlimb lameness. They have not been trained in the more subtle problems, such as the horse which has got a short stepping forelimb gait or lacks hindlimb impulsion and engagement. Because they move symmetrically, they're often said to be sound horses and pain-free, when in fact they're not. They have compromised their gaits in order to try to conceal their lameness, and they do that very effectively, but that doesn't mean that they are pain-free. And if we could identify what their problems are and treat them appropriately, then we can improve their welfare and we can improve their competition performance. They become more comfortable for the rider to ride. The rider can sit in a better position. The rider gains confidence because the horse responds better to the cues. The horse becomes more trainable. It's an absolute win-win situation. If you take away the pain, there's so much benefit for the horse and the rider.
Exactly. And I have so many questions about it. And you said that we're used to actually see the horse behave with his discomfort and it gets normal to us. And actually, in one of the interview I've listened where you were a guest, you mentioned, if I'm correct, that riders rarely experience a horse free from pain. Would you mind elaborate on this, please? Like how come?
I think we know from studies that have been done in the UK, in Switzerland, Sweden, and Denmark, that at least 50% of the horses that are in normal work and are assumed by their riders to be working comfortably are in fact lame, which is quite a high percentage, at least 50%. And I think that most of us learned to ride at riding schools. And the reason that riding school horses are there is because they're safe and they're slow and they don't have big movement. And most of that is because they have some low-grade lameness problems. And therefore, we get used to riding horses, which don't have much quality of movement. We get used to observing their behaviors. Fred is always grumpy. That's normal for Fred, whereas it's not normal for a pain-free horse. And I know, having ridden many clients' horses, and I get on them and think, gosh, this horse is really stiff. And I say, has this horse ever moved more freely than this? And they say, oh, no, this is how this horse always moves. And they haven't experienced what it really feels like for a horse to be moving fluently, to be moving through its back, to be taking an even contact in the reins. They have never had the good fortune to experience that. I have, so I know immediately when I get on the horse if it's experiencing discomfort or otherwise. And I think that until people know what a normal horse should feel like, and they think about what's happening underneath them, they won't recognize the difference between normal and abnormal. And I think from a riding coaching point of view, there's often a lot of focus about how the horse is moving, not asking the rider, what do you feel? What's going on underneath you? How could things be improved? And I think we need to teach people to feel what's going on underneath them, to explain what they're feeling. Exactly. So that they develop a better awareness of both their own body and their horse's body.
Exactly. And I did have another question. You already said something about it, but maybe we can develop a bit. How does pain affect the overall well-being of a horse?
Well, I think we all know that if we're in discomfort, we tend to become less happy, more grumpy. And those are anthropomorphic terms. The horse in pain tries to conceal its pain because the horse is inherently a prey animal. So it wants to disguise the fact that it's uncomfortable. And it does so by shortening its step length, spending more time with each limb on the ground, reducing the range of motion of the back, and having reduced hind limb impulsion and engagement to try to minimize signs of discomfort. But as a result of that, their muscles are not working correctly. So the muscles tend to waste away or not develop properly, and the horse becomes further compromised in its movement. Horses are incredibly good at being compliant despite the fact that they are experiencing discomfort. They will do things that we ask them to do despite the fact that they are in pain. And people say things like, my horse jumps well, so there can't be anything wrong, but it doesn't like dressage. And the reason it doesn't like dressage, or it's less willing to work on the flat, is because it's experiencing discomfort. So doing repetitive movements in small circles and that sort of thing is creating discomfort, which results in unwillingness. And I think that horses which are in pain, for you as a rider, are less responsive to cues. So you put your leg on and nothing happens. You have to be more forceful, more coercive. And this is not a good way of creating harmonious horsemanship. We should be able to use a very light cue and get a response. So horses are their own worst enemy in many respects because they try to conceal their discomfort. But if this continues over time, you will just walk into the stable and the horse will be less engaged with you. It will be more likely to stand there with its a rather closed expression on its face. Instead of looking bright and alert and responsive, it's less reactive. And it may be that when you come to tack it up, the horse may fidget, or it may toss its head up and down, or it may rub its nose against the stable wall, or it may pick up some legs. It may turn the head to the girth when you're tightening the girth. And people think these are normal behaviors, but they're not shown by horses which are not experiencing discomfort. These are behaviors that horses exhibit when they're anticipating discomfort coming either from the tack or from the experience of being ridden. So there are many subtle things that are going on by which the horse is trying to communicate with us that it's uncomfortable, but we tend to either fail to observe these things or fail to think about why they're happening, or just ignore them completely.
Exactly. And you're talking about the importance of like choosing the right tack for the horse. Thankfully, now we have every day more saddle fitter and bit fitter in the equestrian world to help us rider to choose well. There is as well a big debate on the noseband. And I wanted to have your point of view about this, because you were saying that, for example, a sign of discomfort on horses would be opening the mouth repeatedly, which is something we see quite often, but sometimes that we hide quite often, thanks to the noseband, no? And I wanted to ask you, what's your point of view about this matter?
Well, I think, first of all, that if a horse wants to open its mouth, that whatever type of restrictive noseband that you put on it, it will still be able to open its mouth. You may reduce the amount it can open its mouth, but you're not going to eliminate that behavior. And we have demonstrated that with our studies. We have also shown that horses with restrictive nosebands are more likely to be somewhat evasive whilst the bridle is being put on and the noseband is being tightened. I think that the scientific evidence about nosebands and their tightness and their influence on behavior is rather poor science, because, for example, there was one study in which they combined putting on a potentially restrictive noseband on naive horses which hadn't had bridles on before, and they combined it with a double bridle. So they were putting two bits in the horse's mouth and the restrictive noseband, and then concluding it was the restrictive noseband that caused the horse's behaviors. Whereas equally, it could be, of course, the two bits in the horse's mouth.
Of course.
So the science behind noseband tightness, I don't think is very good. In saying that, I think that it is unreasonable to be creating huge pressure around the nose, particularly on the front of the nose or on the back of the chin, by a restrictive noseband that is tightened excessively tight. So I am in favour of controlling the tightness of nosebands as long as it is done in a logical fashion. And the previous ways it's been done in, for example, international dressage, with the measurement being on the side of the horse's face, where there is a concavity in the horse's face, is completely illogical, because that's not where the pressure is. So I am a proponent of the careful use of nosebands. And I'm not saying in any way that you shouldn't use a crank cavesson, you shouldn't use a grackle. I think you have to use what your horse tends to find most comfortable. And bearing in mind that horses' heads are very variable, both in their shape and their size. And you go to the tack shop and you buy a noseband, which is allegedly a horse-sized noseband, it doesn't necessarily fit your horse. Often the buckles finish up being around the horse's lips. That's illogical to me. Why not place the buckles somewhere which is going to be more comfortable for the horse? But I think from a welfare perspective, the nosebands are lower down on my list than the saddle fit.
The saddle.
Because although we have many saddle fitters, we still have an enormous proportion of saddles which do not fit either the horse or the rider. And if the saddle doesn't fit the rider can't be in the correct position and their weight distribution can't be correct. And even when we look at horses which have had recent professional saddle fit, we still find that there's a high proportion in which the saddle does not fit optimally. So in a study of 150 horses, all of whom had their saddles checked within the last 3 months, there were 37% in which when we changed the saddle to a better fitting saddle, the horses immediately improved in their performance. So that's a pretty staggering statistic, I think.
It is.
So just because a horse has had recent professional saddle fit doesn't mean that saddle fits that horse optimally, unfortunately.
So do you think that, because it seems like it is a big question and it's quite of a matter that we have to obviously take care of, but it seems as well at the same time, that something it's not that accessible for everyone. I'm thinking maybe if you're a professional rider, then you're the only person who's riding this horse, but how can, for example, the school can do to improve then the tack fitting for their horses, knowing that there's a lot of people who's going to ride them and maybe they don't have the same resources. How could they do?
I think that is a difficult question to answer easily, in that obviously if you've got riders of different shapes, even just different heights, their position in the saddle is going to be altered. So in a riding school situation, we cannot optimize the fit of the saddle to the rider. But we could do better, I think, with respect to saddles for the horse. So, for example, you could have 15 horses and, say, 10 saddles. And the saddle fitter checks which 2 saddles fit any one horse the best. And those horses can only be ridden in those 2 saddles. And if one or other of those saddles is not available, they should not be ridden. And I have evidence to support that, in that I did some work at a Danish show jumping yard, which is a different situation to a riding school, obviously, but they did have regular saddle fit checks, and they did have a rule that the horses could only be worked in one of 2 saddles. And at that stables, when I palpated the horses' backs or felt the horses' backs, there was no evidence of increased muscle tension or muscle pain in those horses, which is quite remarkable. So there were 56 horses, none of which had increased muscle tension or increased muscle pain, which is a remarkable finding. Despite the fact that some of these horses had lameness, they were still comfortable in their backs, which I think was a reflection of the fact that they had well-fitting saddles. Because it would be very unusual to go through more than 50 horses and find none with any evidence of back muscle tension or pain.
Well, it's very interesting because, as well, there's every country has its own way of doing the things and its own, willing as well to do the things differently.
Yes, absolutely. I've been fortunate that I've worked in a number of different countries and do some consultancy work in a variety of different situations. And it's interesting to observe the differences of cultures and the way of doing things. But in most countries, I would say the equine world is incredibly traditional and not forward-thinking enough and not questioning enough. Why are we doing this? Couldn't we be doing this better? And I think in many instances, we could be doing things better. And I'll hold my hands up. I will say that as a rider, my saddle, as I changed horses and went to the next horse, I used the same saddle and it wasn't refitted for the next horse. I was wrong. These horses could have done better, potentially, had I known more than I do now. The important thing is we try to continually learn and we try to change to improve things.
I'm sure in this way, now we have access to so much information that there's a wave of change and that people are more willing but because as well, there's so much information available right now that it's easier as well to inform ourselves and to learn. But it is true that for some it takes time. and as you were saying about the culture, every country has its own horse culture. I come from France, and I've been in Spain for many years now, but I saw the difference. And even in the same country, you have differences, and it's really interesting, but challenging as well.
Yes, and I think that we don't necessarily understand the best way of disseminating information. There is a lot of new information available, but it's how you spread that and how you get people to listen to it and act accordingly. And people learn in different ways. Some people are very visual and they need to see something. Some people need to read something. Some people need to just hear something. So we have to try and use different methods, and probably no one single method is going to be suitable for everybody.
Exactly. And there's this other thing I found as well. It's like when you've been in the industry and you're professional and you've been riding for so much year, like it's really, really hard. And maybe that's something you've experienced yourself, that to admit you've been doing things wrong for so long. And I think that's really challenging, just to admit, okay, I've been wrong for so long.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we can say about equine behavior during ridden exercise, that we have accepted that all these things are normal for horses, but now we've demonstrated they are not normal for horses. But there is still resistance among some quarters. So there are still people who are absolutely sure that there are lots of naughty horses that need to be trained in a punishment-led way. Whereas if you know anything about learning theory, you may be able to make a horse do something, but that's not the best way they learn and the best way they become habituated to work as we really want them to work.
I had another questions, because we've talked as well about like how to inspire change. And I think for that, like the top level riders can be a source of inspiration, and maybe something that we can, some people that we can copy, like. And we actually could assume that to reach a high level, horses must be in top form and free from pain. Still, in competition, we often observe clear signs of discomfort and pain in horses, even though they've passed the vet check. And I wanted to ask you, how can we explain this, and how can we actually raise awareness about this issue?
Well, they've passed the vet check because they're evaluated moving in straight lines without a rider. And they've got to be obviously lame. And it's not is the horse lame or sound? The question is this horse fit to compete? So if the horse shows a low-grade lameness, particularly if it's a hind limb lameness, it will be regarded as fit to compete. And then a lot of the people that are on the ground juries are not lameness specialists, so they're not particularly good at picking up low-grade problems either. But we know from studies that we've done by observation at competitions that there are lame horses competing at the highest level. And those horses, if we look at the ridden horse checklist, score higher than other horses, and they do less well. So if you take horses at 5-star level 3-day eventing, if they score 7 or more of the behaviors compared with less than 7, overall, they have higher dressage penalties. They are more than twice as likely to fail to complete the cross-country phase. And if they do complete the cross-country phase, they will be significantly lower in a finish place. So that's clear evidence that there is likely to be an influence on performance which is related to discomfort. We've done exactly the same thing at the lower levels of eventing and shown exactly the same thing. So even in horses competing over fences of 1 meter, which is small, still the presence of discomfort has a negative influence on their performance. If we look at Grand Prix dressage, we also see across the range of elite Grand Prix dressage to national level championships, there are a proportion of horses which are experiencing discomfort and they do less well. So there's clearly a relationship between the presence of discomfort and the quality of performance. And I think that's a very strong argument to professional riders to say, well, it's quite expensive and time consuming to compete. Wouldn't you rather want to be close to winning than being in 20th position? Maybe you're in 20th position because your horse is not completely right. And if we could put that horse right, maybe he would do better. He would be more trainable, he would perform better, and you would be more successful.
Exactly, which is quite a good point, even more for the professional riders. And is your Ethogram accessible for the riders too, or do we have to ask for a vet to come and assess the horse with us?
I think it should be accessible to riders. I think you have to take a little time to read the specific definitions of each behavior. So, for example, mouth opening with separation of the teeth for 10 seconds or more. So it's not just occasionally opening the mouth. The mouth has to be continuously open for at least 10 seconds to count as a behavior. And I always say that I think the easiest way to learn is to watch some good quality videos of horses so that you can stop the video, replay it, analyze the horse carefully. So the checklist was designed so that it could be used by anybody. We've demonstrated that untrained individuals can apply it, and they can apply it reasonably accurately. Like any tool, the more you do, the more you practice, the better you get at it, because things happen quite quickly. It's just like a dressage test for the dressage judges. There's a lot going on. But if you train yourself to observe, I think that anybody can do it. But you do need to look at the horse from all perspectives. So you need to look at the horse from behind, from the side, and coming towards you. So that means that if the horse is working on the right and the left reins, you have to change your position. So on each rein, you can see the horse from behind, from in front, and going past you. And that's an important thing to be aware of. It's also important, one of the behaviors is repeated bilateral hind limb toe drag. Now, if the arena surface is really, really deep and it's poorly maintained, all horses will drag their toes through that surface. So you can't apply that behavior. But if the horse was to do the same thing on a beautifully surfaced arena, then the behavior would count. And so therefore, I think that you need to, when you're applying the checklist, have a written version of the checklist with the definitions and make sure that you are accurately applying it. But it doesn't take, you don't have to be a veterinarian. You can teach yourself how to do this without a doubt.
That's great. And where can we access this checklist?
There is a website, 24horsebehaviors.org, or there's a website, Harmonious Horsemanship, and on either of those there is the checklist.
Great. Well, I'll put all the links on the description of this episode. And I know as well that you've got a new book that you've written with a physiotherapist, if I'm right?
Yes. So it's a book called Harmonious Horsemanship, and it says use of the Ridden horse ethogram to optimize potential partnership and performance. And it discusses and gives lots of examples of the ethogram, but how it can be used. It gives real life stories. So riders telling the reader about their experiences. So they had a problem horse. They were convinced it was a problem, but their trainer said it wasn't. They took it to the vet. The vet couldn't see a problem, so sent it back home again, said it must be a training problem. And then eventually they get to a diagnosis. And in some of the horses, we can successfully treat them, and in others we can't. But it enables people to empathize with what other people are going through. And it also discusses how we can use the checklist as a monitoring tool, what you should expect from a veterinarian in terms of how they should go about investigating your problem horse, emphasizing the importance of seeing the horse ridden in order to understand the rider's problems. And it also discusses lots of the myths of the equine industry. Like, for example, my horse is 7 and it's always found canter on the right rein difficult, but he's a weak horse behind, rather than saying, why is this horse weak behind? Why at age 7 can't it canter? There must be an underlying reason for that.
Well, that sounds very interesting. I'll make sure I have a copy very soon next to me because I can't wait to read it. It sounds really, really interesting. And I'll put the link as well on the notes. As well, I wanted to ask you, because we talked about how to recognize lameness, but I'm sure that the best thing is to prevent it. And I wanted to ask you what preventive care practices can we implement, ideally making them accessible to everyone?
Well, I think to start off with a horse which is reasonably well conformed and proportioned is a good start. And then to recognize that whilst you can achieve a lot within the confines of an arena, it is not physically good for a young horse to continually be going round and round in circles on a single surface. So the principle of cross-training, doing a variety of different athletic exercises, not only within an arena, but also going out around the countryside, such that the horse is learning how to move on different surfaces and on different terrains, is really, really important in my view. Having optimal tack fit for both the horse and the rider, so that the rider's weight distribution is as ideal as possible, and having awareness of your posture on the horse. Because if you are constantly slipped to one side, your weight distribution is going to be uneven, and your horse is going to have to compromise its movement to accommodate that. So I think that you as a rider need to take some sense of responsibility for your position and your fitness and your ability to ride in rhythm with the horse. Then I think we always have to think about having sufficient recovery time between training exercises that are very demanding. So we know that if you're a human athlete and you do a hard workout, then 2 days later, even though you're pretty fit, you will probably have some degree of muscle soreness, which is called delayed onset muscle stiffness. And we believe that horses experience the same thing. So if we worked really hard on an exercise on Monday, then Tuesday and Wednesday should be easier days, rather than continually repeating those same exercises. And we also need to know something about how horses learn, because we know that if you repeat an exercise 3 or 4 times, that's probably optimal for the horse's brain.
Mm-hmm.
If you repeat and repeat and repeat, you're not going to make things better, and you may actually make things worse. So if you've done an exercise 4 times over and the horse is doing okay, then stop, go and do something different. And even if the horse is struggling, don't keep going, come back on another day, because you need to think about how horses learn, and no person or no animal learns well in a stressful situation. So if the stress levels are escalating because the horse is finding it difficult, you're not going to achieve anything by trying to work through that. So there needs to be some understanding of the horse's physiology and also its ability to learn. And I think if we pay attention to all those things, we can potentially reduce the risk of injury. But there's no doubt that there are some horses which are inherently injury prone. And I can say that from bitter experience. I bought a lovely 4-year-old, which was the best balanced 4-year-old and the best moving 4-year-old I'd ever bought. And it was chronically lame by the age of 7. lame on all four legs. And I don't think it was the way it was worked. This horse was inherently going to develop problems. And I think that there are some horses like that. So we have to listen to those horses. And if the horse is starting to go wrong, we need to identify what's going wrong at a very early stage. I don't think with that horse, I could have done anything different. That horse was destined to break. But there are other horses who have much stronger constitution that, assuming that you work them appropriately, have the potential to stay pain-free. But even then they can take a misstep. They may be galloping across country and they slip and they injure themselves. But the important thing is to recognize that they've injured themselves. So, for example, Kinvara, my wonderful event horse who I sold to Spain, he jumped into the face of a bank when going cross country, and the next day was marginally lame. I could feel that. Other people said, you're imagining it. I wasn't imagining it. I nerve blocked the horse. I did ultrasound. He had a very early suspensory ligament injury. So I stopped with the horse, gave him appropriate time, and he was absolutely fine. But I know so many times people with that type of injury will either ignore it, or they'll give the horse a few days off and then start it again. And then the next time it's maximally exerted, it'll go lame again. And that cycle tends to get repeated several times over. We must not ignore those early signs. We need to recognize those, because if we recognize them and treat them quickly, we're more likely to have long-lasting success. And Kinvara competed until he was 17 years of age. So he is a good example of that.
Definitely. And I find it quite nice that it's related to Spain, since we're talking today to a Spanish audience. That's great. Very interesting. I do have one question before going through some few quick questions I'd ask to every guest who's coming on the Modern Rider. But I did have one last question. In the same interview I've made reference to earlier, you've said that you're keen on asking questions, and it's something actually you said a bit before, something that has been shared many times on the podcast by other professionals who tell the importance of asking to progress. My question is, what do you do if the person you're asking is answering something that you know isn't true or realistic?
I try to rephrase the question, or put it back to them and saying, do you really mean this? Is that really true? Is this really what you're feeling? So I try to do it in two ways. One, to rephrase the question, but two, to put the answer back to them to say, is this really what you're trying to tell me? And is this really the truth that you're trying to tell me? So I have two different strategies that work most of the time, but not all the time. Okay. And there are some people that you can inherently feel that you are communicating well with, and other people that are unquestionably much, much more difficult.
So, yes, and a bit of luck on being able to process the question, actually. But I find it really interesting because it is true. And I do myself, that's why I interview people, because I love asking questions and learning. But it's sometimes as well, this podcast was born because I had situation where I was asking questions to someone who was supposed to teach me things, but the answer was sometimes completely out of the blue and inappropriate. And I didn't know at the time how to react, because I didn't want to. I was supposed to be the one who didn't know. Mm-hmm. So I didn't say I did know better, but I had a clue that it wasn't the right answer, and it was actually obvious. So that's really interesting to have your point of view in this way. Well, that's it for the main interview. Many thanks to take the time to answer all of them. I do have a few questions, as I said before, that I like to ask to every guest of the show. And the first one is, I wanted to ask you if you would like to change anything about your journey so far.
I wish I'd known more about saddle fit earlier in my career, without a doubt. But I think I've been incredibly fortunate that I have met an amazing cross-section of people who have guided me in so many different ways and encouraged me to think and encouraged me to develop and given me so many opportunities. So I think I've been extraordinarily lucky.
Amazing. Is there any message you would like to share with the equestrian community?
Well, I just think we all need to look at ourselves and ask, is what we are doing the best that we could be doing for the welfare of the horse, bearing in mind that I believe passionately that we should be using horses and using them competitively as well. I'm not trying in any way to say we shouldn't be riding horses. And I would also go as far as to say, I think that there are some lame horses that it's absolutely fine to ride because they're not getting any worse and their degree of lameness is very mild and they're coping with that fine. But I do think we always need to be saying, can we be doing this better? And in what way could we be doing it better?
Love it. Is there anyone you recommend me to interview in the next episode of the podcast?
Oh, that depends on what you want, really. In terms of, you're talking about riders.
Someone who's active on spreading the word to the equestrian community to do things better. So, I mean, we received so much different professional here in the podcast, that from veterinary to riders to anyone who's working on this path and he's willing to share this with as many people as possible.
Well, I would probably suggest Gemma Pearson. She is a veterinarian and an expert in behaviour and a rider herself, and knows a huge amount about how horses learn and how horses should be trained and the mistakes that we make in training. And she's also a very down-to-earth person and I think speaks very eloquently. So I think she would be a good person.
Great. Like it. So we talked about your book earlier, which I definitely put the link and recommend on this podcast. But is there any other book or resources you would like to recommend?
Well, it depends what background you're coming from. I am the author of Diagnosis and Management of Lameness in the Horse, which is an enormous textbook, but it is, I believe, the best textbook about lameness. And it's probably far too in-depth for most riders, but if you want to learn more about injuries in horses, that's the place to go.
Perfect. But we do have some professional listening to the podcast, so I'm sure it would be really interesting for them as well. And last question. There's a playlist on Spotify of guest favorite songs. And I don't know if you're keen on music but would you like to add one to this playlist?
Well, it shows my age. I'm a Beatles fan. So let's take Let It Be.
Love it. Definitely. I'll put it there. We have everything on this playlist. If you want, I'll send it to you, but it's quite great. Well,
I think from a learning point of view, there also is on the Equitopia website about the ridden horse pain ethogram and how to recognize lameness, and with lots of video recordings. And I think that is useful for any level of rider.
Definitely.
Or trainer or veterinarian.
Perfect. I'll put the link as well. I really like this platform. Actually, they do have a lot of great resources to learn on horses. So definitely. Well, many thanks. That's the end of this interview. I'm so grateful, really, because I thought that was one of the most interesting conversation I had so far. So thank you. Thanks for your work. Thanks for taking this time to share everything you've learned. And I wish you the best for everything that's coming to you. And I don't know, what can I wish you more than that?
Nothing. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a very pleasurable experience.
I'm glad. Well, have a very nice day and talk soon. And so we come to the end of our episode today. I hope this conversation was as insightful for you as it was for me. You can find more details about Sue's research and contributions, as well as links to her books in the episode's notes. And as always, I want to remind you that your participation is essential. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, I invite you to leave a note or comment. Sharing it with your contacts is also an excellent way to spread this valuable information. Thank you again for sharing your time with us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for a new exciting interview.